Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are tackling a field that is, I think it's fair to say, inherently complex, deeply personal, and, well, universally relevant.
It really is.
We're talking about abnormal psychology. And this is a field that studies not just the obvious outliers, but the very edges of the human experience. It forces us to confront how we as a society define what it means to be well.
And what it means to be unwell.
Exactly.
That's a profound subject. This discipline, which you'll often hear called psychopathology, sits right at this fascinating intersection of hard biological data, evolving social consensus, and ultimately subjective human suffering.
And our mission for this deep dive is to give you a kind of high-speed shortcut.
Mm-hmm.
We want to move past what can sometimes look like just a catalog of deficits and get toward a more holistic and deeply nuanced understanding of the human condition when it's in distress.
And that's the key, right? We want to unpack the core frameworks.
Right. Things like the 4Ds and how culture can completely shift our understanding of mental illness depending on where you are in the world.
The goal is to empower you, the listener, not just with academic knowledge, but with, practical tools to increase your emotional literacy and communicate effectively when a crisis hits close to home.
Okay, so let's start with the scope. Just how vast is this discipline?
It's truly vast. I mean, you have general psychology, which focuses on normative functioning, how we learn, how we perceive, how we interact when things are going relatively smoothly.
The baseline, so to speak.
Baseline. Abnormal psychology, on the other hand, is entirely dedicated to the scientific study of abnormal behavior, emotion, and thought patterns. It's about the deviations from that norm that cause impairment.
And when you say the span of the field, we are talking about a monumental continuum here. Our sources really emphasize this.
They do. The spectrum includes everything from, say, intense but often manageable neurotic distress, like a severe phobia or persistent anxiety.
Things many people might experience to some degree.
Exactly. All the way up to the most profound disconnects from reality, which we see in severe psychotic disorders. It is an enormous range of human experience.
So it covers conditions like anxiety, mood disorders.
Right. Major depression, bipolar disorder.
Obsessive-Compulsive disorders, trauma, schizophrenia.
Personality disorders, and even neurodevelopmental differences like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
The whole gamut.
And it doesn't operate in a vacuum.
Not at all. It's inherently multidisciplinary. It has to be. It integrates everything from genetics and neuroscience to cognitive theory to large-scale sociology, all just trying to paint the fullest possible picture of why and how people suffer.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If the scope is that wide, what is the purpose? I mean, when clinicians and researchers study this, they aren't just filing things away, right?
No, absolutely not. They're operating under 4 clear objectives, what our sources call the 4 operational mandates.
The 4 pillars that define why this study actually matters.
Precisely. The goal isn't just observation for observation's sake. The ultimate purpose is clinical utility to alleviate suffering. And these 4 pillars provide the scientific and ethical scaffolding for the entire field.
So, pillar 1. The essential starting point is description.
Mm-hmm.
This is the foundational step, achieving precise, clear classification and diagnosis. Why is that so crucial?
Because it all relies on identifying syndromes. A syndrome is just a reliable cluster of symptoms that, co-occurs in predictable ways. It's not just one isolated thing, it's a pattern.
So description is the process of, scientifically, I like this phrase, carving nature at its joints.
That's a great way to put it. It's identifying that this specific pattern of suffering is different from that other pattern of suffering.
And this is why standardized nomenclature, like the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the Global ICD, is so non-negotiable, even if they're imperfect documents.
Absolutely. It ensures a common reference point. Description is more than just applying a label. It's an act of collective scientific validation and global communication.
So a researcher in Buenos Aires and a therapist in Seattle are talking about the exact same thing.
The exact same recognized pattern of, say, excessive, uncontrollable worry. It allows for research comparison and, ultimately, reliable treatment.
Which brings us to the second pillar, explanation or etiology, seeking the cause.
Right.
And what really stood out to me here was the absolute rejection of simplicity. Our sources are clear. There is no single virus for depression like there is for the flu.
That is the modern consensus, and it's a hard-won one. Mental health issues are almost definitionally multi-causal. If you're trying to understand the source of dysfunction, you have to look at biological vulnerability, psychological processing, and the environmental context all at the same time.
Okay, so let's use the core example they provided, panic disorder, because it really shows that integration.
It's a perfect example. If we unpack a person suffering from repeated debilitating panic attacks, we see the multi-causal nature immediately.
So it could start with a biological factor.
It could. Perhaps a hypersensitive amygdala, the brain's fear center. That's the vulnerability.
The predisposition.
Exactly. But then you layer on the psychological factor. When they feel their heart race, they immediately engage in catastrophic thinking. My heart is racing. I must be having a heart attack. I'm going to die.
So their interpretation of the physical symptom fuels the panic.
It pours gasoline on the fire. And finally, the trigger often sits in the sociocultural factor. Maybe they're in a high-stress job dealing with financial insecurity or a relationship loss.
So the panic disorder isn't caused by any one of those things.
It's caused by the confluence, the intersection, and the feedback loop between all three. That integration is non-negotiable for a true explanation.
And once you have that level of explanation, it naturally leads to the third pillar, prediction.
Right. Once you understand the underlying mechanisms and the typical trajectories, you can start to forecast the course of disorder.
Is it something that's likely to be episodic, coming and going, or is it likely to be chronic?
Or potentially degenerative, yes. And prediction is truly the gateway to public health and prevention. We can start to identify high-risk individuals before the pathology becomes acute.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. The sources talked about identifying adolescents who carry a specific genetic risk for schizophrenia, especially those who also began heavy cannabis use during critical periods of brain development.
So you can see the diathesis and the stressor lining up.
Precisely. And if we can accurately predict that trajectory, we can implement targeted preventative and educational support measures years before the first psychotic break. It shifts the entire field from being purely reactive to proactive.
And finally, the culmination, the whole point of it all, is the fourth pillar, control, or what we call treatment.
The ethical mandate is clear: to alleviate human suffering and restore a person's ability to function in their daily life. This is where all the theory gets tested.
So this is everything from psychopharmacology to CBT to community support.
The entire spectrum of interventions, developing them, refining them, all to facilitate recovery and well-being. So those four pillars, description, explanation, prediction, and control, are what move this from a dense academic topic into a vital, life-saving applied science.
Okay, now that we've got the operational mandates, let's anchor ourselves in history. Because the history of abnormal psychology is really the history of civilization trying to make sense of suffering that defies rational explanation.
The shift in how we attribute cause over the centuries is just staggering. We start in the ancient world, which was completely dominated by the supernatural model.
So any abnormal behavior was attributed to external forces.
Purely external. Demonic possession, the alignment of planets, or divine displeasure.
And the treatments reflected that belief system. They were punitive, often horrific.
Unbelievably so. We're talking about exorcism, or the incredibly gruesome practice of trepanation.
Drilling holes in the skull.
Drilling holes into the skull, supposedly to allow the offending spirit or demon to escape the body. The assumption was, if you're acting abnormally, there's something malevolent trapped inside you.
So when did that start to shift?
It finally began to shift with figures like Hippocrates and Galen, who initiated the biological tradition. They made the radical suggestion that these disorders stemmed from internal physical imbalances.
The four humors.
The four humors.
Yeah.
Blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm.
And while balancing bile sounds, almost fantastical to us today, the core idea was revolutionary.
It was. The premise that mental illness is a disease of the body moved the entire issue from the realm of theology and morality into the realm of medicine.
And that laid the groundwork for the modern medical model.
It was the bedrock, even though it faded for a long time. But it saw a powerful resurgence in the 19th and 20th centuries. The game changer was the discovery that general paresis, a severe form of mental deterioration, right, was directly caused by the spirochete that causes syphilis.
Wow, so that must have been an incredible breakthrough, proving that some forms of madness were just physical diseases.
It was monumental. It firmly established that a biological basis was plausible, and it laid the groundwork for the explosion of psychopharmacology in the mid-20th century. Suddenly, we had chemical solutions for what looked like chemical problems.
And at the same time, we had the rise of the psychological tradition, which turned the focus inward to the mind and the environment.
And this started earlier than most people think, with the moral therapy movement in the 18th century.
This was the challenge to the asylum model, right? Chaining patients up.
A direct ethical challenge. People like Philippe Pinel in France advocated for treating patients humanely, unchaining them, promoting restorative environments, treating them with kindness. The idea was that recovery was possible through social and psychological means.
And then, of course, the intellectual powerhouse of the 20th century was Freud and the psychoanalytic school.
Freud introduced one of the most transformative concepts ever, the unconscious mind. For him, abnormal behavior wasn't a disease or a possession, but a symptom.
A symptom of what?
Of unresolved intrapsychic conflicts, managed by defense mechanisms that were either rigid or just failing to cope with reality. It provided this complex narrative explanation for suffering that was neither entirely biological nor purely spiritual.
So for centuries, we were stuck in this battle, body versus mind.
The total dichotomy.
But modern abnormal psychology has moved beyond that, landing on the biopsychosocial model.
Which is the unifying framework today. It forces us to accept that biological factors like genetics, psychological factors like coping styles, and social factors like poverty or trauma are all inextricably linked in a single dynamic feedback loop. You can't responsibly treat one without considering the others.
And this is where it gets really interesting for the listener, because it provides a map for our own experiences. This is where the diathesis stress model comes in.
Yes, it perfectly illustrates this integration. The model proposes that we all carry a vulnerability, the diathesis, which can be genetic or from early trauma.
So it's a pre-existing vulnerability.
Right. And that vulnerability lies dormant, like a dry field, until it's exposed to an intense environmental stressor, a major life event, chronic adversity, acute trauma.
So the diathesis is the potential, the stress is the trigger.
Exactly. It explains that core paradox we see everywhere. Why two people can share the exact same genetic risk, but only one develops the disorder. Or why not everyone who experiences a profound trauma develops PTSD.
It's the interaction that matters.
The interaction is everything. It's the field's most comprehensive way to understand the full complexity of why people get sick.
That's a great foundation. Now we have to tackle the central challenge of the entire field, which is much harder than it sounds. Defining the boundary of abnormal.
The ambiguity problem. It's huge.
Unlike a broken bone, there's no X-ray for this.
There isn't. The line between normal and clinical is incredibly permeable. And trying to use a purely statistical definition just fails immediately.
Why is that? Because statistically rare just means rare, not bad.
Precisely. If we define abnormality as anything statistically rare, we immediately pathologize exceptionalism, extreme altruism, a genius-level IQ, being an Olympic athlete. These are all statistically abnormal.
But we value them. They aren't disorders.
Definitely not. So rarity on its own is not sufficient.
Okay, so if statistical rarity is out, we need something better. This is where the profession uses a structured, practical framework, the 4 Ds.
A heuristic, yeah. A way to evaluate if a behavior warrants clinical attention.
Let's start with the first one, deviance.
Deviance simply means behaviors, thoughts, or emotions that significantly differ from what a society deems appropriate, the unwritten rules of conduct. This anchors abnormality in a social and cultural context.
But this is where it gets tricky, right? The problem of cultural relativism, because norms are always changing.
This is a huge, critical moment for awareness. The most profound historical example, and one that should haunt the field, is that for decades, homosexuality was classified as a disorder in the DSM.
A deviant sexual orientation.
Yes. And that was not a scientific discovery of pathology. It was simply society labeling nonconformity as illness. The category of deviance forces us to constantly ask, are we identifying sickness, or are we just pathologizing difference?
So the takeaway for the listener is, just because something is rare or outside your comfort zone, that doesn't make it a disorder.
Exactly. Now, the second D is distress.
This one feels more intuitive.
It is. It's the subjective suffering experienced by the individual. For many conditions like depression or anxiety, this is the defining feature. The person seeks relief because they are in pain.
But like deviance, distress isn't enough on its own. The absence of distress doesn't mean everything is fine.
And this is a really important nuance.
Yeah.
We see the limitation of distress in 2 major areas. First, in conditions like a manic episode in bipolar disorder.
Where the person might feel amazing.
Euphoric, invincible. They are not distressed at all, even as their behaviors are profoundly destructive, spending thousands of dollars, making ruinous decisions.
So they feel fine, but the objective outcome is a catastrophe.
Right. And second, you see it in something like antisocial personality disorder, where the individual may harm others but feels absolutely no guilt or personal distress.
And we also have to remember that normal grief is intensely distressing.
But it's an adaptive, healthy response to loss, not a disorder to be suppressed.
That brings us to the third D, which is often considered the clinical gold standard, dysfunction.
Or maladaptation, yeah. This is about behavior that interferes with an individual's ability to conduct daily activities.
So this is the practical measure of impairment. Can you hold down a job, maintain friendships, take care of yourself?
Exactly. If a thought pattern or behavior actively disrupts your life, it crosses the threshold. This is what truly separates a manageable quirk from a diagnosable condition.
So checking the stove once is a quirk.
Checking it twice, maybe that's mild distress, a quirk. But if you have to check the stove 30 times, are late for work, and eventually lose your job because the ritual consumes 3 hours of your morning,
That's dysfunction.
that is profound dysfunction. And that functional impairment signals the need for clinical intervention.
Finally, we get to the fourth D, danger.
Danger is behavior that poses an immediate risk of harm, either to oneself suicide, self-injury, or to others through aggression.
And this is the highest stakes criterion, ethically and legally.
It is. It's the most common reason for involuntary intervention. However, and we have to pause here to be responsible, it's critical to address the stigma.
Because danger is actually the least common feature of mental illness.
Statistically, yes, by far. The vast majority of people with mental health conditions are not dangerous to others. Equating mental illness with violence in our public discourse contributes massively to harmful stigma, which in turn prevents people from seeking help.
Okay, so let's move deeper into this intellectual battleground of definition. The core problem is still how to combine objective fact with subjective cultural value. That's where Jerome Wakefield's harmful dysfunction analysis comes in.
This was a huge theoretical contribution because it tried to bridge that gap. Wakefield said the definition of a disorder has to have two independent parts.
Okay, so the first part is the dysfunction.
The dysfunction is the objective scientific component, the fact. It's the failure of an internal mechanism to perform its natural, evolutionarily designed function.
So like an anxiety mechanism firing constantly when there's no actual threat.
Perfect example. The mechanism is dysfunctional. It's failing its evolved purpose.
Okay, so that's the objective biological hardware failing.
Correct. But then you must pair that with the second component, harmful. The dysfunction must also be deemed detrimental according to current cultural standards.
So the mechanism fails, but it only becomes a disorder if society agrees that the outcome is undesirable.
Precisely. Wakefield's conclusion is that the label disorder is a social judgment placed on the consequence of a malfunctioning biological mechanism. It marries objective biology with subjective cultural values.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, within the same arena, we have two big, often competing paradigms. The medical model versus the social model.
The medical model is dominant in most Western clinics.
Yeah.
It views abnormal behavior as a symptom of an underlying disease. It assumes biological causes are primary neurochemical imbalances, genetics.
And the big strength of that model is that it reduces blame. You're sick, not bad.
It removes the moral judgment, absolutely. The critique, though, is that it can ignore the patient's context, risk over-reliance on medication, and maybe foster a kind of dependency.
And then the social model just flips that entire script.
Completely. The social model argues abnormality is largely constructed by society. The problem isn't internal to the person, but in society's rigidity and failure to accommodate natural human variation.
And this concept is incredibly powerful when we talk about the neurodiversity paradigm, especially around conditions like autism and ADHD.
The core idea of neurodiversity is that these aren't disabilities, but natural variations in human neurotypes, different cognitive operating systems. They aren't pathologies to be cured.
So it introduces the fit model. The impairment isn't an internal deficit, but a poor fit between the person and their environment.
That's it. High sensory sensitivity is a disability in a noisy office, but an advantage in quality control. The intense focus of ADHD is disruptive in a traditional classroom, but becomes a superpower in data analysis.
The implication is enormous. It shifts the focus from fixing the person to making society accommodate them.
It challenges the very definition of abnormal by saying different is not the same as disordered.
Now, on the opposite side of that coin, there's a very modern and maybe worrying challenge, concept creep.
This is essentially diagnostic inflation.
Can you define it for us?
Concept creep is the gradual expansion of mental illness concepts to cover a wider range of milder, more common phenomena. Society has higher mental health literacy now, so we're better at recognizing illness, but we also have a liberal bias toward overdiagnosis.
So we start framing normal, difficult reactions to life like intense grief or shyness as pathology.
As clinical depression or social anxiety disorder, yes. The consequence is that while it validates suffering, it risks pathologizing the human experience. We risk diagnostic false positives where healthy people view themselves as fundamentally broken just for being sad or anxious.
That distinction is something we need to hold on to. Okay, let's transition from defining the problem to explaining the cause or etiology. We have to come back to the unifying model, the diathesis stress model.
It remains the most important integrative view. It's the loaded gun analogy. The diathesis, the vulnerability, is the loaded gun.
And the stressor is the finger pulling the trigger.
Exactly. The vulnerability, whether it's genetic or from early trauma, remains potential, not canic, until a major environmental stressor activates it. It's the only way to explain why two siblings with the same genes might have radically different outcomes.
So let's drill down into the three major perspectives that feed into that model, starting with the biological perspective, the hardware approach.
Right, the physical brain. It revolves around neurochemistry. For example, the monoamine hypothesis suggests depression might involve a deficiency in neurotransmitters like serotonin.
Like a car running on low oil.
That's a good analogy for the theory, yes. Conversely, the dopamine hypothesis suggests schizophrenia involves excessive dopamine activity, and anxiety is often linked to low levels of GABA, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter.
The brain's brakes.
Exactly, so the brain is constantly in a high alert state.
And beyond chemistry, we have genetics.
Which is extremely well established through twin and adoption studies. We see much higher concordance rates for conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in identical twins.
But rarely 100%, which proves the necessity of the stressor.
Precisely. And finally, under the biological umbrella, we have neuroanatomy, the structure of the brain itself. Neuroimaging lets us see physical differences, like enlarged ventricles in schizophrenia or a hyperactive amygdala in anxiety disorders.
Okay, now let's move to the psychological perspective, the software, how we process and interpret the world.
The behavioral school argues that abnormal behavior is purely learned through conditioning. A phobia isn't innate. It's learned when a neutral object, like a dog, gets paired with a traumatic response.
And the powerful implication is, if it's learned, it can be unlearned.
Absolutely. That optimism is the foundation of therapies, like exposure therapy.
Then we have the cognitive perspective, which is all about our thoughts.
Right. It suggests that pathology stems from cognitive distortions, irrational thought patterns, or negative schemas.
So what does a cognitive distortion sound like in practice?
The most common is catastrophizing. A minor negative event happens, and the thought is, this means I'm incompetent, I'm going to be fired, and then I'll be homeless. A jump to the worst possible outcome.
Or all or nothing thinking.
If it wasn't perfect, it was a total failure. The entire aim of CBT is to identify and restructure those automatic, maladaptive thoughts.
And finally, we have the sociocultural perspective. We can't understand the individual in isolation.
This perspective highlights the critical role of social determinants. Factors like chronic poverty, unemployment, systemic discrimination, these are immense risk factors.
Because they create chronic, unrelenting stress.
Which overtaxes the whole system. And within that, you have the family systems perspective, which argues the entire family unit is the patient. The abnormal behavior in one person might actually be maintained by dysfunctional communication patterns in the whole family.
That's a robust framework. Now, let's bring in the global lens and ask that uncomfortable question. Can we define abnormal without asking where and when?
This is cultural relativism in diagnosis. We have to reject universal standards of normality. Behavior must be judged within its unique cultural context. If we don't, we are destined to misdiagnose.
The interpretation of symptoms is a prime example. In the West, hearing voices usually means psychosis.
But in many indigenous or faith-based cultures, hearing voices might be a gift, a spiritual calling, or a normal part of grieving. If a clinician blindly applies a Western checklist there, they're committing a category fallacy.
And there's also a difference in emotional expression. We in the West are highly affective. We talk about our feelings.
Many other cultures are highly somatic. Distress isn't expressed as sadness or anxiety, but as physical symptoms. Headaches, fatigue, stomach pain. A clinician unaware of this might miss a depression diagnosis entirely.
To really illustrate this, let's dive into the culture-bound syndromes or cultural concepts of distress.
These demonstrate, better than anything else, how profoundly culture shapes the experience of mental illness.
Okay, let's start with amok from Malaysia and the Philippines.
Amok is a sudden, violent outburst of aggression after a period of brooding, often ending in exhaustion and amnesia. The context is its link to perceived insults to honor in cultures where social standing is paramount.
Then there's Koro in China and Southeast Asia.
This involves intense, acute anxiety that one's sexual organs are shrinking or retracting into the body, which they believe will cause death. It's deeply rooted in traditional Chinese medicine and fears of losing essential yang energy.
And a related syndrome in India, Bat syndrome.
That involves severe anxiety linked to the discharge of semen, leading to fatigue and weakness. This comes from the Ayurvedic belief that semen is an incredibly vital life force, so its loss is seen as catastrophically depleting.
What about attacta nerviosa in Latin America?
This is often triggered by a stressful family event, manifesting as uncontrollable screaming, crying, and trembling. While it looks like a panic attack, it's culturally distinct. It's a socially recognized and somewhat acceptable way to express extreme distress in that context.
And finally, two from Japan. First, Taijin Kifusho.
This is fascinating. It's an intense fear that one's body, their odor, their blushing, is displeasing or offensive to others. The fear isn't of being judged, but of causing discomfort to someone else. It reflects the collectivist emphasis on social harmony.
And hikikomori.
The extreme social withdrawal. Young adults isolating in their bedrooms for months or years. It's linked to the intense pressure of the Japanese education system and changing family dynamics. Understanding these is essential to avoid misdiagnosis.
This shows just how much the experience of being unwell is shaped by society. Now, let's pivot and ask the listener's question. Why should the average person care this deeply about abnormal psychology?
The primary reason is the ubiquity of struggle. We have to dismantle the myth that this only happens to other people. The statistic is staggering. Nearly 50% of the entire population will experience a diagnosable mental disorder at some point.
Nearly 1 in 2 people. That means you will encounter this field in a profoundly personal way, whether it's you, a family member, or a friend.
Understanding that normalizes it and acts as an antidote to shame, and that leads directly to the power of mental health literacy, or MHL.
Which is basically the knowledge that helps you recognize symptoms and assist in prevention.
Right. High MHL correlates with better health outcomes. And since the average person is usually the first responder, abnormal psychology teaches us the specific red flags that differentiate a bad mood from a clinical crisis.
Okay, what are those warning signs?
The sources outline 4 main categories. First, vegetative symptoms. Dramatic changes in the biological machinery, so sleep and appetite, insomnia, hypersomnia, loss of appetite, stress eating.
Second is anhedonia.
A critical one, the profound loss of interest or pleasure in activities that were once intensely enjoyable. If someone stops caring about their hobbies, their pet, that's a serious flag.
Third, cognitive shifts.
Changes in thought content, persistent illogical thinking, expressions of hopelessness, or sudden paranoia.
And finally, functional decline.
A sudden drop in school or work performance, or a cessation of personal hygiene. Without this framework, these signs might be dismissed as laziness or poor character, which dangerously delays intervention.
And this knowledge has another powerful effect. Stigma reduction through causal attribution.
Yes. Historically, mental illness was seen as a moral failing. Abnormal psychology provides biological and psychosocial explanations that dismantle that judgmental view.
If you understand the cause, your reaction changes.
Completely. The power of why is immense. Research shows when people understand the cause of a behavior, their emotional reaction shifts from anger or fear to compassion and empathy.
Like the example of encountering a shouting, disorganized, homeless individual.
Without knowledge, the reaction is often judgment. They're dangerous.
Yeah.
But if you understand they might be experiencing hallucinations from a neurochemical imbalance, like in schizophrenia, the reaction shifts to compassion. This person is sick and reacting in terror to a reality I can't see.
Now, a vital lesson for anyone diving into this is navigating medical student syndrome.
A critical lesson in nuance. When you learn about symptoms, you start to see them everywhere, especially in yourself. But symptoms are common.
So everyone has intrusive thoughts?
Everyone does. But disorders are defined by severity, duration, and crucially, dysfunction. Intrusive thoughts that last 30 seconds are normal. Intrusive thoughts that demand hours of compulsive rituals and prevent you from working, that is dysfunction. That is a disorder.
Understanding that protects us from concept creep, from over-medicalizing our normal, difficult lives.
And allows us to accept that sadness is just sadness, not immediately pathologize it as depression.
Okay, let's move to the most practical section, how this knowledge translates into high-stakes, real-world communication. This is about enhancing emotional intelligence.
Right. Studying this forces us to decenter, to step outside our own experience and accurately consider the internal reality of others, even when that reality is distorted. It helps prevent the personalization of symptoms.
Which is such a common failure point in relationship.
It is. Understanding the spotlight effect in social anxiety helps a spouse realize their partner's refusal to go to a party isn't a rejection of them, but a symptom of profound fear.
Or that an irritable friend might not be rude, but depressed.
Exactly. It reframes behavior as a symptom, not a character flaw. And this knowledge is foundational for effective crisis communication. The typical person responds with dismissive platitudes like, just cheer up.
So let's run through 3 key scenarios, starting with scenario A, the panic attack. What's happening physiologically?
The sympathetic nervous system is in total overdrive. The fight or flight response has seized control. The prefrontal cortex, the center for logic, is often completely offline.
So rational arguments are useless. Therefore, you do not say, calm down.
Because that's dismissive. It implies a choice they are failing to make. Instead, you do say, I know this feels terrifying, but you are safe. I am right here with you. This is validation and safety. You validate the feeling while asserting the reality of safety.
You do not say, you're overreacting.
That just increases shame. You do say, stay with me. This is temporary. It will pass. This offers presence and reminds them the state is finite.
And then there's the grounding technique.
The most effective tool, you do say. Focus on your body. Can you feel your feet on the floor? Let's breathe together. In for 4, out for 4. That forces the prefrontal cortex to engage with an external physical sensation, diverting resources away from the internal catastrophic thoughts.
Okay, next, scenario B, the depressive episode. Here the battle is often self-criticism, being a burden, and hopelessness.
And that dictates the strategy. You do not say, others have it worse. That just induces guilt. You do say, I can see you are in a tremendous amount of pain. I'm so sorry you're going through this. That is pure validation.
You do not say, it's all in your head.
Because that's dismissive. You do say, I'm here for you. We don't need to talk. I could just sit with you. That is presence with low-demand support. It combats isolation without demanding energy they don't have.
And the most common mistake. Have you tried yoga?
Unsolicited advice. It lands as criticism. Instead, you need to directly counteract the core depressive thought of being a burden. You do say, you are not a burden to me. I care about you. That simple reassurance is incredibly powerful.
Finally, scenario C, delusions and psychosis. You're dealing with a fixed, false belief. This is a delicate balance.
It is. You do not say, that's crazy or that's not true. That challenges their reality and damages trust. Instead, you do say, it sounds like you are scared. It must be terrifying to feel like you're being watched. This is focusing on emotion. You validate the feeling, which is real, without validating the delusion.
And you do not reinforce the delusion by agreeing with it.
Never. You do say, I don't hear the voices you hear, but I absolutely believe that you hear them and that they upset you. This is agreeing to disagree with empathy. You maintain your reality while acknowledging theirs, which maintains trust and lets you guide them towards safety.
That is actionable, incredibly useful advice. Now, let's turn the lens back inward. How does understanding dysfunction help us reverse engineer health in our own lives?
It gives us tools for self-regulation. The CDT tradition emphasizes self-monitoring. You can become your own detective.
So, keeping a mood diary.
Exactly. Track fluctuations, identify triggers, spot patterns. I always feel anxious on Sunday nights, or every time I eat processed sugar, my focus crashes. It reframes mental health from a mystery into a manageable data set.
Another core idea is identifying those precursors to emotional crashes, like the Hayek technique.
Borrowed from addiction recovery, but applicable to everyone. AGES stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired.
And the mechanism is simple.
These 4 states are guaranteed to lower your prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate emotion. Recognizing them allows for immediate self-regulation. It reframes, I am having a total breakdown, to the much more actionable. I am sleep-deprived and haven't eaten in 6 hours.
It provides a physical solution to a psychological crisis.
Exactly. And finally, abnormal psychology teaches us to proactively cultivate protective factors to build cognitive reserve.
We established that social isolation is a major risk factor.
So investing time and energy into social connection is not a luxury. It is a legitimate, evidence-based health intervention.
And the same goes for sleep.
Understanding that chronic sleep deprivation is a known precipitant for both mania and depression elevates sleep hygiene from a personal preference to a central priority for mental stability.
This has been a huge tour. Abnormal psychology is so much more than the study of madness.
It's a profound inquiry into the complexity of the human condition, the limits of our resilience, and the influence of our society on our internal experience.
And the field defines abnormal, not to ostracize, but with the compassionate aim of identifying when suffering has exceeded the threshold of normal coping and truly warrants skilled intervention.
And we've learned that the line between health and illness is porous, dynamic, and constantly debated.
By studying the abnormal, we get an incredibly clear vision of the normal. We gain the vocabulary and the empathy to function in a world where mental health is a dynamic equilibrium of biological, psychological, and social forces.
That's the perfect summary.
This entire deep dive into the limits of pathology raises a vital question for you, the listener, to consider. In a world increasingly focused on optimizing every feeling, where concept creep is blurring the lines between sadness and sickness, how do you personally draw the line between normal, difficult, but ultimately healthy human sadness and a genuine pathology that requires clinical intervention? Where do you find and hold that necessary equilibrium in your own life?